It's a pleasure to be here, Bogdan. Thank you for inviting me. Anna, thank you for the good arrangements. Hans-Gert, do not worry. I have a European passport first and a British passport second. Also, I'm not going to try to emulate you by saying anything in Polish. My linguistic challenge to the audience will be trying to have you understand my Cockney English. That's already enough. But I'm also delighted to be here in an activity which is also supported by the Adenauer Stiftung. We have excellent relations, as you know, Hans-Gert, in Brussels with the bureau there. And I also, in your presence, pay tribute to Peter Weilemann, who unfortunately died last year and who did such a wonderful job in putting security policy on the agenda. The other thing is that I'm really glad, ladies and gentlemen, to be back here in Krakow. I was here last in 1976, teaching English for the British Council. It was a different century, it was a different Europe, and it was a different me. I didn't have white hair in those days, and therefore I look much more like the person who was voted by Elle magazine in 1999 as the sixth sexiest man in the universe. But as I walked around Krakow this morning, almost freezing, I slipped into a cafe, I went into a bookshop, I went to buy a hat, and everybody I spoke to replied to me in really good English and understood me, and I thought, bloody hell, I must have done a really fantastic job back in 1976 teaching the people of Krakow English. Maybe I should have stuck to that instead of being a dinosaur in residence at NATO. Anyway, I'm looking at the watch and I realize, of course, that time is running short. You want to ask questions. So for my speech, I will follow the advice of King Henry VIII of my country. You remember he was the one with 6 wives. And he used to say to each of his 6 wives, "Darling, I shall not keep you long." So I will do the same. I'll try to be brief and we can have some discussion. Now, I know that one of the themes that you have on the agenda today is NATO's Chicago summit, which of course is coming up in May, and summits in NATO, like summits in the EU these days, are crunch time when big important issues have to be decided. And Chicago will have its share of difficult but urgent issues. What are going to be the transitional arrangements in Afghanistan as we try next year to hand over the main security responsibility to the Afghan security forces. This will be a challenge because, according to some reports, only 1% of the Afghan national forces today are able to operate totally independently. So we still have a lot of work to do if they are to have the lead already by this time next year. What comes after 2014 in Afghanistan? What will be the size, the shape of the NATO presence? What will it do? How many people will it require? How much money will we need? For how long to maintain an Afghan security force able to fill the vacuum after the departure of ISAF? Who's going to pay for that? Not only, of course, the United States, which cannot possibly be asked to continue to pay $11 billion a year for that effort. What will be the shape of NATO's long-term partnership with Afghanistan in the field of training, military education, and so on? Secondly, the Middle East. This was mentioned already by Hans-Gert. What do we have to say in response to the Arab Spring? What can NATO contribute there in terms of security sector reform partnerships? Missile defense. Will we be ready in Chicago to declare an interim operational capability for at least a rudimentary missile shield to protect Europe? The future of NATO's defense and deterrence posture. Do we still need nuclear forces in Europe? If so, how many, where, why? And if we reduce our reliance upon nuclear forces for deterrence, in this age of austerity, do we really have the resources to compensate by having more conventional deterrence? These are difficult questions, and we have to find answers. Will Russia come to Chicago? And if we can't discuss missile defense because we don't have an agreement with Russia, do we have enough elements in the NATO-Russia relationship, such as Afghanistan or cooperation on terrorism or on airspace or other things? Do we have enough other elements to merit a NATO-Russia summit? So, yes, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear lots about these things later on. I have many of my dear colleagues with me today, Robert in particular from Moscow on NATO-Russia, but many others are here. And we will go, no doubt, into details. But what I'd like to do for a sort of opening, sort of keynote address, and I promise to be brief, is to give you sort of my view, a view from NATO, but also a little bit my view of what the real big challenges are going to be for NATO in this age of austerity. There is always a day after, ladies and gentlemen. And although at the moment we have 2014 very much as the sort of target date, because that's the day when NATO's biggest and most challenging mission in Afghanistan, the ISAF mission, ends. Although we have 2014 in our sights, there will be 2015 and there will be 2016. And what will be the challenge? The challenge will be as follows. For most of my NATO career, when I was a young dinosaur, we have been doing operations. It's been very much, I intervene, as Descartes would have put it, I intervene, therefore I am. NATO has defined its identity very much through the projection of forces to the Balkans, then to Afghanistan, more recently to more limited missions to Iraq. We have sort of existed by doing, and we have demonstrated our relevance to the international community through action. A NATO without a big operation has become almost unthinkable. And our public opinion has become very much accustomed to only seeing threats in the world in places where NATO has deployed military forces. Sometimes, frankly, our public opinions believe that the deployment of those military forces is also connected with the existence of the threat, and that somehow the threat will disappear once the forces are withdrawn. But this has meant that most of the driving force in NATO headquarters on a day-to-day basis has been the need to manage, to organise, to supervise, to review an operation. And virtually all of the things that we associate with NATO, the involvement of partners, the new command structure, the civil-military approach to doing security policy business, the new forms of force generation. All of these things have grown up out of operations. But can you imagine after 2014 a NATO at peace? As Obama has said, the tide of war is receding. In other words, a NATO which goes back to a situation which is not totally unsimilar to the Cold War, except that we don't have a big adversary any longer, but an organisation which is trying to maintain capability while waiting for the next attack or the next crisis to arise. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there won't be other operations. There will be. Anybody who in 1989 would have predicted Yugoslavia would have been called an idiot. Anybody in 2000 who would have predicted NATO going to Afghanistan would also have been called an idiot. Nobody would have foreseen Libya 6 months before it happened. So yes, there will continue to be strategic surprises and operations. But equally, it's unlikely, given the resources, given the political will, after Afghanistan, that at least for a long time, NATO will be doing such a big, extensive land-based operation. Libya, which was shorter, which was fought in the air and at sea, not at land, which was done for much more limited objectives, and which, contrary to the Balkans, contrary to Iraq, contrary to Afghanistan, where a military operation was not followed up by a long-term peacekeeping operation on the ground, Libya may be more the shape of things to come. So what I'd like to do today is present you three challenges which I believe that NATO will need to address in dealing with a situation where we return to peace, at least for a while, after 2014, and where therefore NATO will not be needed any longer to devote all of its time and attention essentially to managing operations. The first one is how do we maintain capability a resurgence capability, a minimum military capability, in an age where peace, inevitably, as it always has done in the past, brings about dramatic reductions in budgets and forces as we recoup a peace dividend. And of course, this time, even more so because of the added, and Hans-Gert referred to this, added pressure of the financial crisis, which in Europe, for example, has led to European defence budgets going from 210 billion euros 5 years ago to 180 billion euros last year. Major cuts in virtually all of our countries, and the United States also now going down by $487 billion over the next 5 years, and perhaps even more as well. So the first one is, how does NATO adapt its capabilities to an age of austerity? The second challenge is, how does NATO adapt itself to a new security environment in which future threats are more likely to come in the form of electrons down fiber optic cables than tanks trying to cross borders and seize territory? And thirdly, how does NATO adapt to the new rules of the game that are emerging in the world in terms of multipolar, multinational management of security policy? I very, very briefly want to simply address those themes. The first one is defence in an age of austerity. Of course, in the past, the result has been hollow forces, most notably after the First World War, most notably in the United States after the period of Vietnam. We have to avoid that syndrome. What are the challenges we face? Number one is, if the United States is pivoting more towards Asia, if the United States is cutting back its forces in Europe, as it is, this was said last week in NATO by Secretary of Defense Panetta, the US which had 320,000 forces in Europe in the 60s, in future will have 37,000 US forces in Europe, based on, essentially on 2 combat brigades. If therefore the US wants Europe to be in the lead, the first question for the Europeans is, to what extent can we still depend on the United States? Article 5, most definitely. I have absolutely no doubt about that. But for the other missions, will the US be there or will it not? Will the Europeans need to duplicate US assets like tanker refueling, like, for example, intelligence and surveillance assets, like targeting experts, drones, on the assumption that we can't necessarily rely upon the United States to provide them. But of course, if we begin to duplicate what in the past we got from the United States unnecessarily, because the United States ultimately will provide those capabilities, we would be wasting a lot of the taxpayers' money. So the first thing is that we have to have a much better idea post-Libya where the US will be there, and therefore we don't need to duplicate, and where it won't be, and the Europeans will need the means for autonomous action. Secondly, as NATO begins to go down, and going down we are, 10% of the organisation has already been cut, another 15% will be cut between now and 2016. The future NATO will be a smaller NATO. The question is, what is the 50% of core capability that NATO must retain in order to be able to do a Libya in a week and not in 10 weeks? What are the core elements that you have to preserve, the 50%, around which you then can build the national additions quickly according to the operational plan? For instance, I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that this 50% NATO has to be obviously a fully staffed command structure. It has to be some kind of intelligence surveillance system based on what we call allied ground surveillance. It has to have some kind of dedicated air tanker capability, which we can build with the European Union. It has to have some special forces. It has to have missile defense, intelligence sharing. It has to have a collective air policing system in Europe. It has to have the NATO response force for immediate crises. And above all, it has to have a training capability. We haven't really needed training much in the alliance over the last 20 years. We've been doing operations, and doing operations is the best training. as we all know, practice makes perfect. But now that NATO may not be doing operations any longer, there is an enormous risk that we will lose interoperability.